Navigating the complexities of maintaining a stable supply chain in an ever changing global environment is a key focus for FDA regulated companies. As U.S. policy shifts, the topic of global supply chain has only become more complex and more pressing. So, how can companies address these challenges? And does this affect the availability and safety of essential products? Join us in the first episode of a new series exploring these questions and more. I'm Leanne Lee, and you're listening to Baker Hosts. On today's episode, Winston Curtin, co-leader of Baker Hostetler's FDA practice and co-leader of the Life Sciences Industry team, will be speaking with Mark Abdu, Associate Commissioner for Global Policy and Strategy, Office of the Commission, U.S. FDA. Let's listen in.
Hello, I'm Winston Curtin, and today it's my absolute pleasure to welcome my friend Mark Abdu to the podcast. Mark is the Associate Commissioner for Global Policy and Strategy, Office of the Commissioner, US FDA. In this role, Mark provides executive oversight, strategic leadership, and policy direction to FDA's global operations, trade and diplomacy activities, and engagement with international stakeholders. Mark joined FDA in 2013 as the inaugural director of the Office of Public Health and Trade, where he led FDA's efforts related to the Trans Pacific Partnership and Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership trade agreements. Prior to his tenure at the FDA, Mark served in other senior positions in the federal government, including senior advisor in the Bureau for Food Security at the U.S. Agency for International Development, director for Global Health and Food Security at the National Security Council, and in various senior positions in what was then the Office of Global Health Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Health and Human Services. We're delighted and privileged to have Mark join our podcast today. Mark, how are you doing?
Good, Winston, and thank you for having me today. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you.
Great, great. It's difficult to avoid hearing almost daily, if not hourly, about U.S. government policy shifts impacting global supply chain for FDA regulated products. These policy shifts include tariffs, especially as relates to China, onshoring, trade relations, FDA changes, reimportation, export controls, and investigations such as Section 232. And for our listeners not familiar with Section 232 investigations, a Section 232 investigation, which is initiated under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, is focused on determining whether imports of a particular article threaten to impair U.S. national security. So, with this litany of policy shifts, Mark, I want to pose a couple of questions to you today around these shifts and the impact of these shifts. So, the first one I want to throw out there at you, and I'm sure our listeners want to know, is how are these policy changes influencing regulatory practices?
Great. Thanks for the question, Winston. It certainly is a challenging one because policy changes are ongoing. We're in a very dynamic moment, and there's a lot going on in the policy space. So I'm going to do my best here to answer your question. I think the changes we're seeing and will continue to see in the administration will require FDA to be agile in how we operate and to continue to think about how we're overseeing products that we regulate that are coming into the country. At the heart of some of these policy shifts, including the President's Executive Order 14293 on regulatory relief to promote domestic production of critical medicines, the 232 investigation that you mentioned, and the tariff and reciprocal trade negotiations, is the goal of shifting the paradigm in which we're regulating, right? The president believes we've got an unlevel playing field. We're going to try to level the playing field first between foreign and domestic manufacturers, and then ultimately tilt that playing field to the benefit of US patients and consumers. And of course, industry as well, including by increasing competitiveness in industry in the United States. It's early days still, so we'll see how all of this continues to unwind, but we are very active in all of these negotiations. We are working to streamline facility approvals and inspections without compromising safety, to shorten time to stand up new production lines, and to ensure that production is adequate to the circumstance. And we're also thinking about imposing higher fees associated with the cost of inspecting foreign manufacturing facilities. Both of those things are prominent in Executive Order 14293, and both of them are things that we are very actively working on currently.
Wow, wonderful. It's good to hear and it's refreshing to hear that FDA is still engaged. We tend to hear in the news that FDA is not engaging, if you will, and I find that to not be the case. And it's certainly based upon the litany of activities that are on your plate, it certainly demonstrates that the agency is really actively involved around these policies. One thing that my clients tend to ask is about the long-term effects of policy shifts. While they're happening, obviously folks are trying to pivot and respond and strategize. But what are the potential long-term effects on access to safe and effective drugs, as well as medical devices, right? We tend to, here in the US, use a significant amount of medical devices in our treatment protocols. So, how are drugs and medical devices and the safety and effectiveness of those two areas? How do they stand up in this rapidly changing global environments? And what do you see as long term effects to access?
Sure. And to go back just to a comment that you made a moment ago on the FDA being disengaged, I think quite the opposite is true. Our commissioner, Dr. Marty McCary, has been actively communicating through all sorts of different types of media. He's just released an article in JAMA on the priorities for the FDA going forward. And all of those things combined demonstrate a clear engagement and a clear intent for the FDA to be very active in the regulatory space to make sure that American consumers have the goods that they need and that those goods are safe and of assured quality. For the question more directly, I think that the policy changes that we're seeing are all aimed at making sure that there, over the long term, is access to the things that Americans need. I don't think any of the changes that we're seeing have big implications in terms of safety or quality or our requirements. They are geared at shoring up our supply chain, making sure that we are inspecting appropriately and catching things that we wouldn't otherwise catch. It's a big priority for the commissioner to conduct unannounced inspections, particularly in India and China. And everything that we're thinking about internally is really focused on gold standard science, common sense, and accelerating the access Americans have to important products.
That's reassuring, Mark, and I appreciate that lens and that viewpoint. Just picking up on, you mentioned a couple of times unannounced inspections, and you just mentioned more specifically in India and China. And one question that pops up is really around FDA enforcement discretion in adapting policy changes. So, how will FDA's enforcement discretion apply more generally to these policy shifts? And then, if you wouldn't mind, because I don't know that there's anyone in government or industry for that matter that has the exposure that you've had to both China and India, how would FDA enforcement discretion apply around these unannounced inspections that you referred to?
That's a really interesting question, Winston. And my general answer to that would be maybe enforcement discretion will apply and maybe it won't. And I know that's not a real satisfying answer necessarily, but let me unpack that a little bit. Now, the agency has a lot of tools at its disposal to perform its function, enforcement discretion being one of them. And the application of those tools, I think, needs to be specific to the context, right? When we saw big shortages of infant formula in the past administration, we used enforcement discretion to make sure that we were having adequate supply of formula in the marketplace. We did so only after making sure that we were able to assure that the supply that we were allowing in was of adequate quality and met our standards, even if not to the letter. So it's a tool at our disposal. But with regard to unannounced inspections, I think the goal is quite the opposite. It's not to create discretion, it's to shore up areas where there might be quality lapses or there might be manufacturing deficiencies that we haven't been getting to because we've been notifying firms of our inspections and they've had time to clean up, so to speak, before we get there. And so it's really zeroing in on protecting the public health in a way that is just common sense. And given the volume of product coming from India and China, it just makes sense that those would be key countries for us to in. And the good news is we've got staff on the ground in both of those countries to help us with our public health regulatory mission.
That's great. That's great. Can we, if you don't mind, Mark, can we touch a little bit on reimportation and onshoring? Much has been in the news lately about reimportation, and so how does that fit in your mind to the discretion and also onshoring? You and I have had other opportunities to speak on this topic in other forums around onshoring. So maybe we start with onshoring and give me a sense of, again, full disclaimer, not necessarily this is what the agency is charged with, but just some color around how that would potentially work, as well as if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit your thoughts on reimportation.
Sure. So on onshoring, I think it's important to understand a few things. First is that there's a lot of dialogue going on, and that is really important dialogue across entities within the government and dialogue with outside stakeholders so that we get to the best place possible in onshoring. The executive order that I mentioned earlier is a good step in that direction. And I think will create a foundation for improvements in our domestic manufacturing capacity. And as I said, we in FDA are ready to play the part that we're called on for in the implementation of that executive order. I think, as we've talked about before, the issue is complex, and there are certainly multiple economic factors that go into business decisions, and the executive order is an attempt to make some of those decisions easier for companies. In terms of reimportation, there's also a growing interest. This interest has been around for a long time in having Americans able to adequately access products they need if they are of assured quality. And so we'll continue to look at Section 804 and see how those importation programs can really be made more efficient in order to help patients get access to what they need and do so in a way that is affordable.
Wonderful, wonderful. This dovetails right into my last question, and you've been just tremendous, Mark, responding to some of these difficult type questions. I'm a collaborator, right? And I'm always amazed by the collaboration that occurs across industries and across sectors, right? And with all these policy changes, with everything that we're hearing in the news, it appears to me that is a facet that is going to provide success, right, across the board for US patients and patients arguably globally. So my last question to you is, how can collaboration between regulatory bodies, and we don't have to just focus on FDA because I know you have a very international remit. So regulatory bodies in the US and outside the US and industry stakeholders and policymakers, how can a collaboration between these three key groups, if you will, be strengthened?
I think collaboration is key, as you well know, Winston. We do a lot of collaborating here at FDA through my office, but also through our product centers in both the medical product space and the food space. And most of the challenges we are facing as regulators are really complicated these days. And in order to really avail ourselves of the best possible thinking, we need to collaborate with others to benefit from their knowledge and their institutional frameworks. And I don't see any of that diminishing over the course of the next several years. I think that will only increase. And we're trying to make sure that we've got the appropriate tools for that increase in collaboration around gold standard science and common sense solutions to pressing problems. I think the commissioner has been really clear about the need for collaboration as well. If you look at his JAMA article, it talks about collaboration and engagement with stakeholders, including industry, to make sure that we are accelerating cures for patients. And the same would be true in the food space, I think, as we look at what other jurisdictions are doing to assure healthy food for their populations. Once the collaboration wheel gets going, I think it creates a really virtuous cycle that benefits everybody, creates greater efficiencies for us as regulators, improves health for our patients and consumers, and creates opportunities for industry, particularly industry here in the United States, to flourish. I am all in on collaboration and appreciate all of our partners that we've been working with, both here in the United States and abroad, in pursuit of our mission of protecting and promoting the public health.
That's great news. And I will be sure to continue to encourage my clients to seek a spirit of collaboration and not just in spirit, but actual collaboration with the agency as we go along. I have some small clients, smaller company clients that I believe will really benefit from engagement early and often as we evaluate the impact of these shifts. So we're at our time mark, and you've just been an excellent guest of Baker Hosts. We really appreciate you. And we will be delighted, absolutely delighted, if you will join us again in the future. Stay well, and thanks again.
Thanks, Winston. It's been wonderful to talk to you today, and I'd be delighted to come back in the future, and I wish you the best.
Thank you.
Thank you, Winston and Mark. If you have any questions for Winston, his contact information is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening to Baker Hosts. Comments heard on Baker Hosts are for informational purposes and should not be construed as legal advice regarding any specific facts or circumstances. Listeners should not act upon the information provided on Baker Hosts without first consulting with a lawyer directly. The opinions expressed on Baker Hosts are those of participants appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the firm. For more information about our practices and experience, please visit bakerlaw.com.